My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Lord, Lord Trevethan and Oaksey, and I think his final question and suggestion was a very pertinent and encouraging one. Like other Noble Lords, I thank the Noble Lord Foster of Bath for securing this debate, and indeed all the work the Noble Lord has done over many years on this issue, and I declare my position as a member of Peers for Gambling Reform. But I want to begin for a change with some positive good news. And this picks up something that the Noble Lord, Lord Foster, mentioned, which is the ban on various forms of advertising that has come into place in Sheffield following a decision of the Council in March. This is a really great demonstration of the fact that campaigning works can make a difference. I know some of the people who've been campaigning for that in Sheffield over a significant period. And it's also a demonstration of the public desire to have healthier environments, healthy societies, which is what indeed this public health measure does. So this is a ban within the limits of the power of Sheffield Council, applying to authority-owned hoardings. It also covers, as well as gambling and betting products, short-term loans, alcoholic drinks, fossil fuel products, some breast and infant milk formulas, petrol, diesel and hybrid plug-in vehicles. So you can see the focus here on health. But I think one of the really important points to make is that, as the Director of Public Health in Sheffield, Greg Fell, said, this is not going to break our gambling harm epidemic. And it really is important to see that the public health sector sees this epidemic being there, but it does set an important direction of travel. But my direct question to the Noble Lord the Minister is, local councils, local communities are expressing a desire to see these gambling adverts and other harmful adverts out of their communities. Will the government, if it won't act centrally, I prefer it act centrally, but if it won't act centrally, will it actually allow local communities to make that decision for themselves, not just on the sites they control, but on all of the advertising sites within their communities? And I think the really important point to make here is how much this advertising is focused in poor and disadvantaged communities. In Sheffield, the group Ad Free Cities found that 60% of the advertisements were in the poorest areas of the city, just 2% of the adverts were in the most affluent locations. And if you look around the country, more than 4 in 5 outdoor billboard adverts are focused in the poorest areas of England and Wales. These are impacting negatively on people's lives, on the environment in those communities. Now, like other Noble Lords, I commend the Library, as usual, for its excellent briefing. All of the evidence is that, aligned with a deluge of gambling advertising that we're all being exposed to, we are seeing a great rise in the problem of problem gambling. The new methodology from the Gambling Commission, we're talking about 2.5% problem gambler rate. That's more than 1 million people. This is an addiction problem, a public health crisis. The GamCare helpline, more than 52,000 calls and online chats in 2023, up 24% in the previous year. Now, other Noble Lords have referred to the situation of football, and I again want to refer to the fact that there is a strong, fast-rising grassroots campaign saying we want something to be done about this. As far as I've been able to discover, AFC Wimbledon was the last club to join the Big Step campaign, calling for an end to all gambling advertising in football. Now, that campaign is part of Gambling with Lives, the charities set up by families bereaved by gambling-related suicide. And I don't think anyone's said this figure yet, but I really do think it needs to be recorded here. The government's own estimate is there are 496 suicides related to problem gambling every year. And just thinking about how much people are suffering, one figure, in the first weekend of the Premier League last August, fans were subjected to 11,000 gambling adverts. And I just want to take a moment to put this in the broader context. We have an epidemic of problem advertising. And just figures out this morning from the WHO shows that the UK has the worst rate of child alcohol abuse worldwide. We have a real problem where advertising is creating an unhealthy society. We need a much healthier society. That's something that the government itself will often acknowledge. Gambling is part of a much broader problem. There is no right to advertise. We have a right to say as a society, we don't want to force unhealthy products on people and communities.
My Lords, I echo others' thanks to the Noble Lord, Lord Foster, for securing this debate and also for his work alongside the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, with others on Peers for Gambling Reform, campaigning tirelessly for this reform over the past several years. And while the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, can't be in this place today to add his voice, I'm sure I echo the sentiments of all members when I say we look forward to welcome him back very soon to be able to add weight to this conversation. My Lords, we've heard this afternoon that the link between problem gambling and serious harm is well documented. Not only the financial impact of gambling addiction, which may on its own drive individuals with large gambling debts into theft, fraud, other forms of criminal activity, but also impacts on relationships, on work, at school, serious harm to both physical and mental health. Public Health England identified problem gamblers as at greater risk of dying from any cause and significantly increased risk of dying from suicide, as we've so eloquently just heard. These consequences, as well as having impact on those individuals, all lead also to indirect harms to children in those households. So I welcome the government's response to the committee's second report on gambling regulation, particularly the commitment to use funds from the levy to commission independent research around gambling and gambling-related harms. However, I'd want to echo the committee's calls for this research to be undertaken urgently, and specifically on the link between gambling advertising and gambling harm for children, and would ask for a commitment and a timeline to address that recommendation. Research by Gamble Aware, released this month, makes clear that children and young people are exposed to high level of gambling advertising, particularly online. And while we've heard that this link has not been proven to be causal, we have heard about the research undertaken that finds that about 34% of those who bet in the UK themselves allow to being influenced by advertising, with over 15% claiming that ads cause them to increase their gambling, and a similar percentage said that viewing ads resulted in them taking up gambling again after a break. But my Lords, gambling reform is not my particular area of expertise, but I have done a significant amount of work over the course of my ministry with at-risk children and young people, and currently as Vice Chair of the Children's Society. So Ofcom's most recent report finding that around a quarter of 5 to 7-year-olds own a smartphone, with nearly a third using social media unsupervised, caused me great concern. We know our children are increasingly online, and we need to ensure that we're keeping pace with what is a rapidly evolving online landscape to protect our young people, our children, from harm. New technologies are significantly increasing exposure to advertisement, sponsorship, marketing, and our current codes must be updated urgently to reflect this. Social media forms a huge part of the gambling industry's advertising practices. I was really shocked to read recently that 92% of content marketing ads sent by major gambling brands were not obviously identifiable as advertising. That particularly impacts children. My Lord, I too would like to close with an example illustrating that current guidance to protect children and young people simply isn't fit for purpose. As recently as a few weeks ago, a gambling firm was promoting a game on social media marketed with 3 cartoon frogs. Now, taking a dip with the Riveting Rascals might appeal to some adults, but it would also almost certainly appeal more to children. Such advertising should not be allowed.
My Lords, I start with a small confession. I live in the village of Lambourne, which is the centre of the racing industry. If there ever was an industry that is linked to gambling, it is racing. But, my Lords, I then made me think about what is my reaction to gambling. That's the fact that I don't sit on horses and do not gamble very much. My Lords, it is the fact it is a day out when you're having drinks in a nicely dressed up environment watching racing. Virtually everything we are talking about today does not apply to that scenario. Everything we're talking about today is about casually watching something on a screen, either the one in our pockets, which I've just remembered to make sure is switched off, or it's something on a TV screen, or it's a screen at home. And the fact of the matter is that that device in our pocket means we can gamble at virtually any time. You only have to be conscious to gamble on that. So we have a totally different situation to the one to which I was originally relating to the gambling experience. It is a private activity. We know that the constant hits do lead to addiction, so we have got a situation of how do we control this, how do we limit it, how do we limit the inevitable damage in a few cases to those few cases, my Lords, because that's effectively what we're talking about here. Also the case, as has been mentioned by many other people here, the fact that children have always been, witty advertising lives with the young, even if you didn't apply it. How many witty smoking adverts do we all come up with? Quite creative, fun things, running jokes. The Silk Cut advert. You even waited and thought, even as a non-smoker, oh, what's the next joke? They buy you buy in. It's very easy to do. Some people take the biscuit, some don't. But the fact of the matter is the amount of money that is spent on advertising by somebody clearly means that the providers of this service see the link. And as they're not going bankrupt at a rate of knots, one assumes they know what they're talking about. What are the government going to do about making sure it is difficult for people to access gambling services? We've had suggestions, and Lord Smith, more difficult identification process is going through a very good idea about the fact that actually, and a warning saying, the person who's guaranteed to make money on your bet is the bookie, I think will be something that actually is a very creative idea. And I hope that we'll be running with it. My Lords, what is government doing in a systematic manner to make sure that children have more problem getting access to this? If the parents actively help them, we may have more problems still, but what are they actively doing? And what are we doing to make sure that the places where the young, particularly, and going up to about 24 might be a good idea here, aren't going to see these by accident? And that is probably the principal objective here. Are you going to see these witty, well-placed little adverts by accident? Are they something you take on board? Late night TV, now you cannot. If you watch anything that crosses a watershed, so you find yourself being subjected to advertising gambling. Not subjected, and that's probably wrong because you can always switch off. But it's there. It's there it's always going to be around. It's always there. What are we going to do to make sure it doesn't happen? My Lords, finally, when it comes to sports and the big stadiums, if the Premiership are starting to take it off their jerseys, as jersey shirts to anyone we call them, why aren't government encouraging everyone to remove these over a period of time. There's always a run-in, but all professional clubs, let's face it, we are proving to sport generally, and the biggest sport of all, that government will intervene eventually. An encouragement to make sure we are removing this advertising, or at least controlling it, within the stadium and on the players' bodies would seem to be a reasonable step. We can give them some warning, but we can reduce it. If it's going to be in the director's box, maybe fine, but it doesn't have to be on the side of the pitch. Can we make sure that there is some vision and thought pattern about restricting this? Because at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a coherent one, and I look forward to seeing how that's going to change.
My Lords, I join with others in thanking the Honourable Lord Foster for bringing forward this topic for short debate. It's very timely, and he is an indefatigable campaigner on this issue. It's often said we all like a flutter, and it's probably true, though you'd struggle to get me buying more than a raffle ticket. For most who choose to take part, it is an enjoyable and harmless activity, but at its extreme, gambling can be addictive, damaging to family life, relationships, personal, mental and physical health, and can be life-destroying. I'm sure pretty much all of us will have come across people in our lives who've got a gambling problem or who have been impacted by gambling problems. I know I have, and it was sad and tragic to see. The DCMS Select Committee reported last year that around 1/3 of a million people experience problem gambling, and it is likely that many more suffer gambling-related harm. The Library briefing for this debate, based on updated Gambling Commission data, estimates that it may well be over 1 million. GamCare reports that the number of people seeking help for gambling-related harms is increasing. In the year to January 2024, requests for help rose by 24%, and the NHS is reporting increased demand for its gambling clinics, and this is before we consider those who are struggling but don't feel able to ask for help. I want to focus briefly on the need for better research. The DCMS Select Committee, in their inquiry into the Gambling White Paper, recommended that there is an urgent need to better understand the effects of gambling advertising on the risk of harm. They found that the White Paper, while the White Paper produced existing evidence base, did not show a causative link between gambling, advertising and harm. It seems clear that advertising encourages participation in gambling, and that this effect is more pronounced for children and those vulnerable to gambling harm. It is the case that the activity of the gambling industry clearly suggests that they believe that advertising is a driver of interest and support for gambling. In 2018, Regulus Partners reported that investment in marketing increased between 2014 and 2017 from £1 billion to £1.5 billion, roughly 10% of the industry's £13.8 billion revenue. Much of it targeted now to gamblers online. The Select Committee recommended that the government must commission independent longitudinal research on the link between gambling advertising and the risk of gambling harm, including specifically looking at the impact on children. My Lords, this needs to be a focus of the funding made available by the statutory levy. I have two questions for the Government Minister. In their response to the Select Committee published last week, the Government stated that levy funding will be directed towards independent research on gambling and gambling-related harms, which, and I quote, could include further advertising-related research. Can the Minister confirm to the House today that levy funding will be directed at research on the link between advertising and gambling harms, particularly in relation to children? And secondly, and I'm sure the Minister must be expecting this, when can we expect the Government to publish their consultation on the statutory levy? The response to the Select Committee gives little away when it states that we should expect in the coming weeks. My Lords, sport is another key issue here. Many noble lords have spoken of this. It's a huge part of our national life, our family life, and something which children are exposed to and enjoy alongside older family members. Alongside welcome and effective measures including the whistle-to-whistle ban and plans for gambling sponsorship to be removed from the front of players' kits, that the Minister will be aware of the concerns raised over the amount of gambling advertising which young viewers are still exposed to during sporting events and which they cannot opt out of. So it's welcome that the Central Cross-Sport Gambling Sponsorship Code of Conduct has been finalised, and that one of the 4 core principles is the protection of children and other vulnerable people. I must ask the Noble Lord, the Central Code has been finalised, but can the Noble Lord the Minister confirm if it's been published so it can be accessed by parliamentarians and sports fans? Some of us are both. And can the Minister give an update on when we might expect individual sports to publish their bespoke versions of the code? And can the Noble Lord the Minister tell us if the government is alive to the VIP managed clients who now generate some 83% of gambling companies' profits with their direct online marketing techniques? One of the core principles of the code, by the way, is that gambling promotion will be socially responsible. Can the Minister tell us more about what that looks like? And finally, my Lords, we welcome the ongoing work on delivering the White Paper. This is an area on which there is a sizable amount of activity and considerable consensus. What members of this House are seeking to do is to ensure that that activity is focused, is delivered at pace, and that no crucial issues are allowed to fall through the gaps.
Well, my Lords, I too thank the Noble Lord, Lord Foster of Bath, for initiating today's debate and for the way he opened it this afternoon. I had the pleasure of working with him and a number of Noble Lords who've taken part in today's debate on the Select Committee, which he mentioned before I became a Minister at DCMS. So thank him for his tenacity in this area. The government recognises the concerns that he and many other Noble Lords have raised about the impact of gambling advertising, particularly regarding its impact on children. The debate about advertising reflects really the balance that we're aiming to strike with our vision for the gambling sector more broadly. Regulating an innovative and responsible gambling industry on the one hand, and fulfilling the duty of government to protect children and the public more widely from gambling-related harm on the other. That is why, as part of our review of the Gambling Act 2005, we took an exhaustive look at the best available evidence. We certainly are not dismissive of evidence. On the contrary, we've sought to take an evidence-based approach, and the white paper that we published in April last year includes a robust, balanced package of reforms to prevent and minimise the risks of gambling-related harm. Since the implementation of the Gambling Act under the last Labour government nearly 20 years ago, gambling, advertising, marketing and sponsorship has become more visible and widespread, and we've seen a visible integration of gambling advertising within sport. While this continual growth has not resulted in an increase in gambling participation rates or in population problem gambling rates, which have remained broadly stable for roughly 2 decades, it is important that there are a range of robust protections on advertising in place to ensure that it doesn't exacerbate harm. The rules on gambling advertising are set by the Committees of Advertising Practice, which operators must follow. A wide range of provisions in the codes are specifically designed to protect children and vulnerable adults. Compliance with these codes are a condition of Gambling Commission licences, and the Commission can and does take action with regard to adverts that are in breach of the codes. Furthermore, the industry code for socially responsible advertising includes a television watershed on all gambling products apart from bingo and lotteries. Children's exposure to gambling advertising on broadcast television is declining. The industry's whistle-to-whistle ban has cut the number of pre-9 p.m. betting adverts to around a quarter of their previous level, and further cut the average number of sports betting adverts seen by children to 0.3 per week.
Pre-watershed. I was in too much of a hurry to keep in the 5 minutes. Sorry.
I'm grateful to the noble lady, and I hope what I've said is nonetheless helpful in relation to the points that she raised in her speech, which I welcome. But we do recognise that there is good evidence to show that gambling advertising can have a disproportionate impact on those who are already experiencing problems with their gambling, and that some aggressive marketing practices are particularly associated with harm. The Noble Lord Trevethan and Oaksey mentioned a study which reflects that. And evidence from the Gambling Commission shows that 35% of problem gamblers received incentives of offers to gamble daily, compared to 4% of non-problem gamblers. Furthermore, while 10% of gamblers with a non-problem or low-risk score, according to the Problem Gambling Severity Index, were influenced to gamble more by direct marketing, this rose to 41% amongst those with a moderate risk or problem gambler score. We also recognise that content often used in gambling advertising can inappropriately appeal to children and young people. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Derby, raised such an instance. That is why we have introduced a suite of measures further to prevent potentially harmful impacts of advertising, specifically for children. Since October 2022, advertising rules have been strengthened to prohibit content which downplays risk or overstates skill involved in betting. The rules also ban content which is likely to be of strong appeal to children, and I will raise the frog-based example the Right Reverend Prelate gave with officials in that regard. As a result of this ban, top-flight footballers or celebrities who are popular with children are banned from being in gambling adverts. In line with the existing gambling advertising rules, the Premier League's decision to ban front-of-shirt sponsorship by gambling firms will commence by the end of the 2025-6 season, breaking the direct association between gambling brands and popular players. The Noble Lord Trevethan and Oaksey suggest that there should be warnings to potential players on gambling adverts. Robust rules from the Advertising Standards Authority prevent content and adverts which, for instance, promote gambling as a route to financial success. Adverts on television must direct people to support services that are available, but we're also working with the Department for Health and Social Care and the Gambling Commission to develop independent information campaigns about the risks of gambling, taking that out of the hands of the industry itself.
Apologise for interrupting him, but I really find it very difficult. He stands at the dispatch box and talks about all of these rules when I gave a very specific example of a Paddy Power advertisement, although it's not called an advertisement, that simply had a large photograph of the manager of Liverpool, Jurgen Klopp. Does he believe that that was a correct thing for Paddy Power to have done, and should it have been banned?
Well, as with the case that the Right Reverend Prelate raised, I will take that up with officials, but I'm spelling out some of the actions, some of which are still to come in, as I say, the rules that the Premier League are doing by the end of the forthcoming season. So I'm sure the Noble Lord will reflect that some of the work has been done and some of it is coming in shortly. But I will raise the case he mentions with the team at the department. And as we set out in our white paper, we're also working closely with the Gambling Commission to take targeted action on advertising to ban harmful practices and ensure that it remains socially responsible wherever it appears. The Commission has recently consulted on new rules to give consumers more control over direct gambling marketing that they wish to receive, and on strengthened protections to ensure that free bets and bonuses are constructed in a way which doesn't encourage excessive or harmful gambling. The Commission will set out its responses to these consultations soon. Together, these measures will empower customers and prohibit harmful marketing practices to prevent the risk of gambling harms. The Noble Lady Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle referred to the powers that are available to local authorities. As she reflected, these vary from local authority to local authority, but as we heard in the debate, the Metro Mayors who have the power in London and Manchester are using the powers that are available to them. And to prevent gambling-related harm effectively, there is no single intervention that provides the answer. That's why we've taken an holistic approach, which includes action on products and protections for players. We recently announced the introduction of stake limits for online slot games, where we've seen evidence of elevated levels of harmful gambling. And we are pursuing broader protections, such as financial risk checks, which will require online operators to identify and take action in relation to customers who are financially vulnerable. That will prevent runaway losses, which we are still seeing happen too often. The government is clear that effective and innovative collaboration to get the right mixture of interventions for the population as a whole, as well as those with specific needs or vulnerabilities, is required to tackle gambling harm. A key part of that approach is the government's decision to introduce a statutory levy, which I know has been a long-standing priority for the Noble Lord Foster, which the Noble Lord Bassam and others raised. Lord Foster, in his opening remarks, dwelt on the importance of evidence, and perhaps I should end my remarks by acknowledging that further work is needed to build the evidence base to ensure that policy and regulation is able to deal with emerging issues, and also making clear, in response to the contribution from the Noble Lord Bassam, that developing quality evidence is a priority for our statutory levy. Through the levy, increased and ring-fenced funding will be directed towards high-quality, independent research into gambling and gambling-related harms, including in relation to advertising. We will continue to monitor the evidence base, and if new evidence suggests that we need to go further, then we will look at this again. The government will also be responding to its bespoke consultation on the levy and will set out its final decisions soon. So I thank the Noble Lord, Lord Foster, soon, very soon. I thank the Noble Lord Foster Bath for tabling today's debate and all those who've spoken in it, and I'm certain we will return to this topic again ere long.
My Lords, questions on a statement made in the House of Commons yesterday on defence spending.
May I remind your Lordship's House of my register of interest and specifically my associations with the Royal Navy. My Lords, as my friend, the Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey said in the other place yesterday, there is much to welcome in this statement, and any and all commitments of additional resource for our national security will receive cross-party support. It is clear that we live in an increasingly dangerous world. Our dedicated and professional service personnel are operating in multiple theatres, securing UK interests and supporting our partners. Every day we ask more of them and their families, asking them to make sacrifices so that the rest of us remain safe and secure at home. So these benches welcome the new commitments to build up stockpiles, boost defence exports, give priority to domestic defence production and set up a new strategic headquarters in MOD. All commitments the Labour Party have been calling for months. It is welcome to see the government listening to the arguments made by the opposition. I also want to take a moment to applaud the additional support for Ukraine, both announced here and in the US. Their fight is our fight. My Lords, a fortnight ago, Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, when confirming our cast-iron commitment to the deterrent, made our position clear. A future Labour government will have a fully funded plan to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence. So our aspiration is the same as the government's. And as always, there should be no political point scoring on matters of national security and defence. What there should be, what there must be, is the opposition holding the government to account for their policies and their competence. So on that note, I hope the Noble Elder Minister can assist your Lordship's House in answering questions that the Secretary of State struggled to do so in the other place yesterday. Where is the fully costed plan to get us to 2.5% by 2030? Only a matter of weeks ago, His Majesty's Government presented and passed a budget. The Associated Red Book made it clear that the government was planning to cut real-term spending on defence by over £2.5 billion in this financial year. So where is the additional money coming from, and why didn't it feature in last month's budget? The Secretary of State keeps referring to page 20 of this Defending Britain policy paper, which was launched yesterday. My Lords, the annex on page 20 does not outline where the money is coming from. It does, however, state the MOD budget for each year up to and including 2030-31. Given the additional commitments the government has rightly made to our allies in Ukraine and which we support, the annex in the policy paper actually shows a cut in defence spending planned for 2024-25. This was not in the press release. On various media interviews in the last 48 hours, government representatives have stated that some of this new funding will come from a cut in civil service numbers by some 70,000 posts. My Lords, the last time this government pledged to increase defence spending by cutting the number of civil servants was in 2015. The number of people in post actually increased by 50%. So please forgive my cynicism, but we've heard this before. And while on the point of civil servants, can the Noble Earl, the Minister, confirm that the MOD will not face cuts in their workforce? As last check, the staff employed by the MOD do the roles that we would prefer to be done by civilians rather than those in uniform, from R&D to procurement and business services. Any cuts in these areas will undermine our effectiveness and, in places, our national security. My Lords, no one in this House disagrees that the strategic environment in which we operate is becoming more challenging every day. And whilst hindsight is a wonderful thing, I genuinely fail to understand why it is only this week that the government has decided to respond to the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace's assertions that the defence budget had been hollowed out. My Lord, since 2010, 15 billion has been wasted on failed procurement. Our army is now at the smallest size since Napoleon. 1 in 5 ships have been removed from the Royal Navy fleet. More than 200 airframes have been taken out of service since 2019, and morale in our forces has fallen by 20% since the Labour Party left office. There is clearly work to be done to ensure that with increasing threats and growing tensions, we are fighting fit. My Lords, this month marks 75 years since a Labour Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, signed the original NATO treaty. My party helped to found NATO, and our ongoing commitment is unshakable. The Labour Party has the same aspiration as the government, defence spending at 2.5%, the same level of defence expenditure last achieved under a Labour government. We will always do what is needed to defend Britain, and we will always spend what is necessary to deal with the threat our nation faces, and we will do it with a fully costed plan.
My Lords, like the Noble Lady Baroness Anderson of Stoke-on-Trent, I am here to fully support His Majesty's Armed Forces from these benches and to say, A, how proud we are of His Majesty's Armed Forces and what they have done in recent months and years, and to endorse the spending commitments that His Majesty's government is making, but also to express some concerns about where the funding will come from. Now, the Noble Lady obviously had a better version of the policy document than I received, because the one I have has no page numbers at all. So if there is a page 20, I have no idea where it is. But we do have the annex, spending detail. Thank you. I'm told that this is indeed page 20. The percentage of GDP that is being looked at from 2024 to 2025 starts at 2.32% and goes up, according to this, to 2.5%, in line with His Majesty's government's commitment outlined yesterday, the 23rd of April. Yesterday, the 24th of April. But I note that this is a memo UK GDP based on OBR's latest forecasts. There is sometimes a little scepticism about OBR forecasts, and while far be it from me to raise the sort of concerns and scepticism that a former Prime Minister might have raised about the OBR, could the Minister reassure the House that the forecasts for 2, 3, 4, up to 6 years out are actually likely to be correct, because it matters enormously for these commitments that the OBR predictions should be right, because the commitments that are being made now are vitally important. The Noble Lady Baroness Anderson asked why this week. As something of a cynic, I wondered whether it wasn't simply part of the Prime Minister's working his way up to a general election, because every day this week we seem to have a new announcement, whether it's flights going to Rwanda or whether it's the commitments to defence. But while on Rwanda we might disagree, on defending Britain we don't disagree at all. It is vitally important, and in that sense the statement is welcome. But there are a few questions that I wonder if the Noble Earl could enlighten the House about. Clearly, the commitment is there to defence expenditure. It comes following on from the commitment to improving defence procurement. But this is a relatively short time frame of 6 years. In the context of global crises, which we see from authoritarian regimes, as His Majesty's government has suggested, Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, all of which seem to work in consort in some arenas. So, does His Majesty's government think that this commitment, in itself welcome, is actually going to deliver change sufficiently swiftly? How far is His Majesty's government looking to closer cooperation, not just with our NATO allies, and obviously we're also committed to NATO, but to our NATO allies as a collective, but also strengthening bilateral relations, for example, with France, in addition to the commitments made in Germany 2 days ago? And further, how far is His Majesty's government thinking that other regional patterns of cooperation, such as AUKUS, are going to be helping His Majesty's government take the leading role in NATO, which has been stated is a real ambition? In the policy document, the Secretary of State reminds us that in his Lancaster House speech, he'd noted that the era of the peace dividend is clearly over. That is obviously right. 2030 is actually very close in terms of procurement and in terms of ensuring that we have the right industrial defence base. Does the Noble Lord the Minister feel that this statement goes far enough, and is he going to commit to coming regularly to the House to tell us how it can be delivered, and in particular the numbers of civil servants who might be still in post in the MOD? Are their numbers vulnerable alongside those of other civil servants to pay for this deal?
My Lord. My Lords, this is indeed a very historic document, and I'm extremely grateful for the support that we've received from all sides of the House and outside as well. Noble Lords will be well aware of my views on defence spending, should be by now anyway, so I'm delighted to follow the commitments made by the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State in the other place that we will now reach the 2.5% of GDP that we've long talked about by 2030. The headline figure throughout, where I appreciate Noble Lords will want to see more detail, and quite rightly so, is the £75 billion spent between now and then. Over the next 6 years, this additional funding to the budget will take us to the 2.5% of GDP, which at that point will work out at £87 billion in defence spending by 2030. If you allow me to get into the weeds for a moment, on page 20, which I promise you. Page 20, this is the document. Of the pledge document, you will see how we intend to reach this trajectory, and it is a flat line. It doesn't tip up at the end, it is a flat line from now, and how the NATO qualifying defence spend matches up against the core defence budget explanatory note at point 2. And to be clear, this is the same metric used across the alliance, across the NATO alliance. The figures used are also based upon the OBR March 2024 GDP forecasts, and as is standard practice, and cash totals will be confirmed at the relevant spending reviews as time progresses. In short, my Lords, this increase to 2.5% will be funded in full through savings, reallocation of resources, more efficient outputs, ruthlessly pursuing waste and delay, of which we know there's been a lot, and projected economic growth, and driving productivity throughout MOD without any increase in borrowing or debt. We will better invest in our relationship with industry, a critical point, in including 10 billion over the next 10 years on a new munitions strategy, and through the integrated procurement model, we will radically reform and modernise our armed forces following the Haythornthwaite review, and we will capitalise on our existing research and innovation expertise through the new Defence Innovation Agency, the DIA. And, my Lords, what is more is that this is in addition to the further substantial package of support also announced this week, our largest yet, to our allies in Ukraine. And many thanks, my Lords, for the support, continuing support on that. Some £500 million of support alongside, that's as well as these 60 boats, including raiding craft, 1,600 strike and air defence missiles, more Storm Shadows, a mixture of 400 protected, armoured and all-terrain vehicles, and nearly 4 million additional rounds of small arms ammunition. My Lords, I think we can all agree that this is significant news, and most importantly, the 2.5% must be spent wisely. It must be spent wisely. As the Prime Minister stated in Poland earlier this week, we didn't choose this moment. We did not choose this moment, but it falls with us to meet it. And finally, I would just say that in the heightened, before going on to answer the questions, in the heightened area of instability that we now face, our first duty in the Ministry of Defence is to the national security and defence of our nation at, when it comes down to it, pretty much any cost. So, if I can just address some of the specific issues. On the question of Ukraine, we have now raised the contribution this year to 3 billion, and that level is going to continue going forward. As to why it wasn't, why this wasn't covered in the budget, there was obviously an enormous amount of negotiation going on at the time, and it was in the relatively recent past. Putting these sorts of plans together, it just wasn't ready. But if you look at the situation now, we've got the economic plan starting to work properly. Inflation is down from over 11 to over 3.2%. We've having continuing deteriorating security environment, and that has meant that's given us an opportunity to set the 2.5% target that we agreed to some time ago. On the question of civil service cuts, this, as you know, the Chancellor, my Lords, the Chancellor made a statement that he wanted to return the numbers in the civil service across government to the figures that they were before the pandemic struck. The Ministry of Defence is going to be a beneficiary of that. There's no suggestion that there should be a cliff edge here. This will take place in a gradual process over 3 years. The turn and vacancy level is quite perceivable within that period of time. And in fact, although there is not a recruitment ban, there is a 2-for-1 at the moment in place in the MOD. On the size of the forces, I think what's more important, and we've talked about this really quite a lot, is that it's to do with capability as much as anything. And this harking back to the size of the army 200 years ago, you know, things were quite different then. They weren't too different 50 years ago, but it was things are quite different now, and I think we've learnt an enormous amount with the issue in Ukraine, and that is why the DIA is being set up. And what that is hoping to achieve is a grouping together of all existing R&D bodies into a single, responsible and empowered organisation, in particular the enormous strengths this country has in DSTL, which is really quite remarkable, to scale up R&D, to drive cutting-edge defence technology in high-tech stuff such as Dragonfire and hypersonic missiles, and low-cost, high-impact stuff, such as single-direction attack drones. And actually, if I could just mention Dragonfire as an example, I think the Secretary of State used this as well, is that my noble friend, my friend, the Minister for Procurement, has used the new integrated procurement model to work on Dragonfire, and he's brought the gestation period forward 5 years. So I think when we were talking about the new procurement model, there was an issue about how effective that would be, and on this particular exercise, it has proved to be very effective. On the question of NATO, and NATO has really never been more important than it is now. The attempt, the commitment to move to 2.5% has been very widely welcomed and accepted. It wasn't long ago when the idea of most NATO countries moving to 2% was quite a difficult ask. And I think, as Jens Stoltenberg said, the UK is leading by example in moving to 2.5%. There is a hope and an expectation that that example will help to move other NATO countries in that direction. So both bilaterally and as a defence alliance, I think that's certainly the intention, and I understand it's been very well received. In fact, I've just come from a meeting with some United States colleagues, and they were A, extremely appreciative, and B, absolutely understood where we were coming from. So that was very good indeed. AUKUS and GCAP are absolutely fundamental to our international relationships, and there is, and I certainly will commit to the House that I will come and depends how long I'm here, but I will certainly come and keep everybody absolutely up to date, particularly about the civil service, the size of the civil service within the MOD and all other matters in relation to what is a very considerable ask on the British public.
My Lords, can I remind your Lordship's House of my specific interest as a member of the Executive Committee of the Army Board. I welcome this announcement. It is a significant amount of money, and I commend the government. My noble friend will forgive me, however, if I don't judge success by financial input, but by what capabilities this money will deliver, and crucially, when. Our armed forces have been hollowed out, principally by gifting to Ukraine. So can my noble friend reassure me that some of this money is not just for new capabilities, but for replacing existing capabilities that have been gifted? And finally, if there's one enemy in all of this, it is the Treasury. In my humble experience, it's all very well having commitment of money to defence, but unless we get prompt Treasury approvals on time, all of this capability will be delayed. So can he simply reassure me that appropriate conversations with the Treasury have been made?
My Lords, I thank my noble friend for that question. On the question of the Treasury, the Chancellor has been absolutely involved throughout this entire conversation and is fully supportive, as is the Prime Minister, of exactly what we're trying to achieve here. On the question of gifting and the replenishment of munitions and stocks, everything that we have gifted and recently gifted, the announcement this week, everything is within its sell-by date, but is no longer really necessary. There are replacements of new modern equipment coming in, and it is the Army is perfectly happy to gift this to the Ukrainian effort.
My Lords,
Peter Carrington and Dennis Healey, two great Defence Secretaries, and I've been trying to work out how they would have reacted to this statement. They would certainly have welcomed the increase in defence spending. It's clearly necessary, and they would have said so. I think they would both have said it's not enough, but it's certainly to be welcomed. Dennis Healey certainly would have found it impossible to accept the construction of the 75 billion. Could the Noble Lord Earl confirm that 75 billion is reached only by making the rather ludicrous assumption that the baseline is flat in cash terms, no increase in real terms, reductions in real terms in every year of the 6-year period? That is the baseline on which one can build annual increments summing to 75 billion. Perhaps he could confirm that's the case. Dennis Healey would never have tried such odd accounting. I think in the case of Peter Carrington, he would have argued that it is unwise not to prepare the country for a certain amount of pain. The government is trying to present necessary defence increases as painless. It might be better to admit that there will be a cost, either in taxation or in less money for domestic programmes. But the defence of the realm is the first task of government. And I think it might be as well. It is also absurd in the week in which President Biden and Speaker Johnson have come forward with a rather substantial programme of assistance to Ukraine, for our Defence Secretary to stand up and say that the NATO partners looked at each other for leadership and the UK government stepped forward to provide the alliance with the decisive leadership demanded in this knife-edge moment. And in the build-up to the NATO summit in Washington, he, Mr. Schatz, will be doing all he can to get alliance members to follow our lead. This is absurd talk. Speak softly and carry a big stick. The stick is slightly bigger, not big enough in my view, but slightly bigger after this week's announcement. But we must learn to avoid the bluster and bravado and speak more sensibly.
My Lords, on the question of the financial detail, it is quite a complicated thing, and I think it is better if we write and explain how the figures are built up. On the question of the ask of the British public, I mentioned that in the it is clearly an ask in the British public. The cake is finite, as I've said before, and defence needs more. It's not an inconsiderable amount of money that we are increasing the defence budget by. And there is a question of how much money you can spend over a period of time. It's not like building a house. You can't spend it all at once. You have to build up. And if you look at where the investment focus is within the next few years, it is firstly in firing up the UK industrial base, including 10 billion for a new munitions strategy, and that is extremely important. Secondly, ensuring that our armed forces benefit from the very latest technology, DIA. Thirdly, guaranteeing long-term support for Ukraine. If we don't do that, it's just going to become more and more expensive. And as the Secretary-General said the other day, this is the cheapest time to defeat the Russians. And fourthly, in ensuring that expenditure is effective through radical procurement reform, which I've already covered.
My Lords, all of us will welcome any increased defence expenditure at a time of maximum turmoil and trouble in the world. And there is much in this statement that is to be welcomed, not just the extra money, but also the aspects on resilience and the rest. But if I could turn this attention back to what the Noble Lord Kerr said, because these increases in defence expenditure only matter in terms of the capability that they will produce And that depends very much on whether or not these figures are actually accurate. And is the contention that they are fully funded going to be correct? Many of the economists and experts outside, having looked at the figures overnight, are questioning very deeply the veracity of the figures. Not only the fact that the £75 billion that is championed here is based on an assumption about flat cash values of expenditure, but also the fact that there is a gap between the £4.5 billion a year that the government says they will spend and the £7 billion that will actually be in the. How is it going to be? How is it going to be actually produced? Mr. Ben Saranto of the Institute of Fiscal Studies says that what is proposed will not be fully funded. He said it's in the ballpark of full throttle austerity. And the Resolution Foundation says that the contention that it is fully funded is a joke. Well, since we're not laughing, and since these matters are of national and international importance, can the Minister now tell us precisely what is the veracity of the figures that have been produced?
My Lords, I really appreciate the detail of that question. It is of course, the importance of getting the figures right and where the money is actually coming from is critical to the success of the entire endeavour. The detail is such that I would rather write than try to answer it now. But there is no doubt that the commitment to this level of expenditure has been made and will be delivered.
My Lords, there are.
My Lords, the commitments to Ukraine are immensely important today because Russia must be defeated for the sake of all democracies globally, and that's both the short-term increased commitment and perhaps even more important, the long-term commitment the Minister has referred to. But right now, for Ukrainians living in that country, right across that country, they are experiencing ballistic missile attacks on energy infrastructure, heating infrastructure, and homes, hospitals and schools, which they do not have the systems to defend across the country, and increasing use of Russian air assets on the front line. This country itself is short of ballistic missile defence systems, so what will be done to improve those for the UK over the long run? But more immediately, what can the UK do to join those pressing for the supply of Patriot and other systems capable of defeating these missiles? A number of European countries who aren't able to supply themselves have offered to fund the purchase of such systems. Is the UK supporting that work?
The Noble Lord makes a very good point. I mean, most of the conversation about some of the issues that Ukraine is unfortunately facing at this particular time starts with air defence missiles. And I think that it's not just in Ukraine, but also the other states which could be threatened by the Russian Federation. So there is an enormous effort in the production of these missiles to try to provide what is necessary, not just in the short term, which is moving them around, but also in the long term. And it was extremely good news to see the United States pass through their commitment to Ukraine, and already some of the missiles have been delivered. So it's a very good point made.
My Lords, in 2021, the government published the integrated review titled Global Britain in a Competitive Age, refreshed, of course, in 2023. This is described as setting out the UK's overarching national security and international strategy, and this covers defence, security, resilience, diplomacy, development and trade, as well as elements of economic and science and technology policy. Can the Noble Lord the Minister tell me that in making this spending announcement on defence, that the government has made a full consideration operating within that systemic approach to security of thinking about how we may also need to increase spending on diplomacy, on issues like the climate emergency? Has this all been considered systemically in the round in terms of looking at the allocation of resources?
My Lords, yes, I can assure the Noble Lady that that is exactly the conversations that have taken place, and one of the reasons why it has perhaps taken slightly longer to get to this position than I and many others would have liked.
My Lords, there's an intriguing sentence in the statement which says that we are now producing a new plan for the first time to bring together civil and military planning for how we respond to the most severe risks facing the country. I would have thought perhaps Lord Robertson's 1998 Defence Review and the Strategic Defence and Security Reviews we've done since 2010 tried to do that as well. But does that plan include cooperation with European partners? Because there are some very impressive figures for defence industrial investment in the statement, but it reads a little as if we're on our own in Europe in doing this. In fact, Germany is increasing sharply its defence spending and is providing more support to Ukraine than we are. France is also ramping up its defence industrial spending. Surely is this not a moment, in terms of resilience, to work more closely with our European partners, coordinate for the effect that that would have in terms of scale and speed in developing the weapons and supplying them to Ukraine?
The answer is yes. The Noble Lord is absolutely right. It is critically important that we work with our international allies, whether they're European or elsewhere, to ensure that what is developing is both complementary, but also that we are producing what is required rather than unnecessary stockpiles of weapons and munitions. And actually that was, again, one of the points that our American colleagues brought out earlier this afternoon. They were very, very pleased indeed with the progress that we've made so far.
My Lords, in introducing the statement, the Defence Secretary said, "But we will remove 72,000 civil servants from the system, not because we do not think they are good people. Fortunately, with low unemployment, we know they will be gainfully employed elsewhere." Can the Minister tell me, were there any negotiations with the trade unions? Are we to believe that there are 72,000 civil servants doing nothing? And if that is not the case, can the Minister tell us what services are either going to be reduced, curtailed, or ended altogether? Because I think I would like to hear an assurance that there will be negotiations with the trade unions in the implementation of this policy. I don't oppose the policy, but I do wonder about that little bit of it.
My Lord, the 72,000 comes from the Chancellor's desire to move the size of the civil service back to the situation that it was in 2019, before the COVID virus struck, and the civil service was required to grow quite considerably to cope with that situation. And that situation has now passed, and it seems logical that we start to move through a period of natural attrition. There's no suggestion there's going to be sort of mass requirements to get back to a position where the civil service is fit for service, lean and nimble.
My Lords, this is too little, too late, but it's still good news because actually we are spending some money on it. What is particularly good news is the support going to the Ukraine. We've got to defeat and stop Putin in Ukraine, or else we're going to have to stop him in Europe. So that has to be good news that we've done that. Now, I have to say I have some concern about where this money is going to come from, but on the assumption we are getting it, can I go down in the weeds and get one small little area? The Royal Fleet Auxiliary is absolutely crucial to the Royal Navy. And, for example, it's one of their ships that's doing the Gaza support. It's the Littoral Support Group, Admiralty, are both RFA ships. Proteus, a new thing to looking at the undersea cables as an RFA ship. A lot of these RFA now are stuck in harbour because there is a real issue, because the Royal Fleet Auxiliary have suffered real reductions in pay and conditions of service. And could I ask the Noble Earl that to go back to the MOD and say, as one of the first little kick-starters of money, that is looked at, because without the Royal Fleet Auxiliary being manned, the Royal Navy actually grinds to a halt. And there are other areas across the Army and Air Force, small little things in the manpower arena, that will make a huge difference.
My Lord, I could not agree more. As to the question of too little, too late, I think that it is extremely welcome that we are where we are now, and it's possible that it is absolutely critical that NATO faces up to the Russian Federation and defeats Putin, because, as the Noble Lord quite rightly said, if we don't do it now, it'll be Europe next, and then that's going to cost an enormous amount more, both in human terms and financial terms. On the question of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, I entirely agree. Conversations are taking place, and I was in the Black Sea in one of the littoral states last week, and they were talking about the two ships that are now in Portsmouth, ready to make the way over, and what a good move that was.
My Lords, I welcome the statement from my noble friend today, and we've had many very important questions raised today. But if I could just for a moment ask my noble friend perhaps to give us an update and also perhaps not to forget the accommodation that our armed forces personnel live in and to make sure that their conditions are not forgotten and to make sure that the upgrades and the improvements that are required are part of this plan.
My Lord's a very, very good point. Accommodation is absolutely critical in both recruitment and retention. Within the plan, there is £4 billion expenditure over the next 10 years to both upgrade and build new service accommodation. Actually, at the moment, 97% of what we currently have meets the government's decent home standards, but we still continue to work with suppliers to make sustained improvements on the existing portfolio of properties. But it's a point extremely well made that we have to make certain that not just accommodation, but all service, pay and conditions are absolutely at the highest level.
My Lords, we will allow a moment for the House to prepare itself for the next business. My Lords, motion for debate, the supply of genuine affordable housing. Viscount Chandos.
Homes fit for heroes. My Lords, 105 years ago, Lloyd George made a commitment to building houses for those returning from the horrors of the First World War, central to the general election campaign immediately following the armistice. The heroes that we've applauded more recently, while never forgetting the bravery and dedication of our armed forces, have been the NHS workers who, through the COVID pandemic, displayed a courage and commitment to public service no less than those in the military. COVID's evolution from pandemic to endemic has not relieved the pressures on the NHS and its workers, who are still widely regarded as heroes in their care for patients. But for many of them, and other individuals and families on low incomes, the availability of truly affordable housing is as scarce as it was for those returning from the front in 1918. I'm privileged to have the opportunity to introduce this debate today on affordable housing, even if it's depressing to confront the sheer scale of the problem. I'm conscious of the profound knowledge and experience that the other speakers today have in this field, and I'm very grateful that they will be bringing their expertise to bear on this problem. I'm truly delighted that the Noble Baroness Lady Smith of Llanfaes has chosen today's debate in which to make her maiden speech, which I very much look forward to hearing. There is, of course, my lords, rarely a day when the problems of the housing market are not central to public debate and news coverage. This week, the Nationwide Foundation and the Church of England led a powerful group of organisations and individuals in the publication of Homes for All, with a wide-ranging analysis and suggested priorities, to which a cross-party group of your lordships has contributed. Much of this debate is around the overall housing market, rather than the affordable and social sectors on which we are focused today. Of course, this overall market is relevant to the affordable and social sectors, but is the context for and driver of the underlying problem. If housing costs generally were not so high in the UK, then market rents and market purchase prices would be affordable further down the scale of household incomes. One vivid illustration of the underlying problem of this has been given by Paul Cheshire, the Emeritus Professor of Economic Geography at the LSE. In 1955, a dozen eggs cost a little under 6 shillings. How nostalgic it is to express it in the currency of my childhood, or 28 pence in this newfangled decimal currency. If the price of eggs had increased in the subsequent 50 years or so at the same level as the price of housing land, the price today of a dozen eggs would have risen to £91. The sclerotic and political planning system lies at the heart of the shortage of housing land and its consequent eye-watering price, which is why I welcome the Labour Party's clearly and rigorously defined intention to reform the planning system. Even if the electorate chooses later this year to give the Labour Party a mandate to push through its planning reforms, the need for more affordable and social homes will remain. Even if over time a Labour government can address low pay and the position of those through no fault of their own on benefits, there will still be a need for more affordable housing. I promised myself not to overload my remarks today with figures, but there are a few which are inescapable in illustrating the scale of the problem. There are 1.2 million individuals or families on local authority waiting lists for social housing. Over 100,000 are in temporary accommodation. Over the 10 years to 2021, the completion of affordable and social homes averaged 50,000 a year. During this period, critically, homes built for social rent, 65% or less of market rents, fell from around half of that to a fifth. Affordable rent, 80% of market rents, which represents a still intolerable burden on the lowest income households, has become the largest part of this broad sector. And the remaining category of shared ownership or low-cost ownership is likely to be way out of reach for those lowest income households. The Social Housing Commission calculated in 2019 that over 3 million social homes needed to be built over 20 years to meet needs, over 150,000 a year. The Bramley paper for the National Housing Federation in Crisis made its own analysis and reached a very similar figure of 145,000 per year. Mission impossible. The challenge, should we accept it, is to triple the level of affordable and social housing built annually compared to that achieved in the past decade, and to ensure that of the almost universally accepted total house building target of 300,000 homes per year, 50% should comprise affordable and social homes, compared to the 25% in recent years. Should we accept this challenge, my lords? Yes, of course. Let us unlock our inner Ethan Hawkes and Ilsa Fausts and accept the challenge. Because if we do not, we condemn hundreds of thousands of individuals and families to a life of financial hardship, anxiety and distress. The provision of affordable housing, most importantly, contributes to the well-being, happiness and mental health of individuals and families who are otherwise living insecurely in overcrowded and substandard conditions, while paying a disproportionate share of their income for that privilege. But in addition, there is clear evidence of a wider economic benefit from improved productivity, better workforce participation, greater rates of innovation, and critically, improved provision of public services in which so many lower earners work. Back to where we came in, my lords. These economic benefits, GDP and tax revenue enhancement, cost savings on temporary accommodation, from reduced reliance on short-term agency workers, for instance. In the medium to long term, these at least mitigate the cost of increased investment in affordable and social housing. But in the shorter term, there is inevitably an upfront financial cost, as well as the challenge of executing such an expanded building programme cost effectively and as fast as possible. I was thinking, there's no silver bullet. Then that reminded me of a consulting firm, a Micro McKinsey, which I've worked with in the past, rather wonderfully named by its founder the Silver Bullet Machine Manufacturing Company, the emphasis on the word machine. The point the founder was making in a dryly humorous way is that looking for a random single large silver bullet to solve a problem is vanishingly unlikely to be successful, whereas establishing a system or process that identifies and utilises a number of smaller silver bullets is far more likely to be productive. Each of central government, local government, housing associations and the private sector needs to play their part and, if necessary, be empowered to do so. It should be a true mixed economy. Each party may act alone in some cases or in partnership in others. Each has challenges. Local authorities rightfully aspire to the central role that they have had historically, but the restrictions on their ability to reinvest the proceeds from right to buy over the years has significantly reduced their financial firepower. The increase from 40 to 50% retention recently announced by the government is welcome, but why not 100%? The reduction in building activity over the past 45 years, exacerbated by the vicious cuts in local government funding by Conservative or Conservative-led governments since 2010, has left many local authority housing departments atrophied. It will take time for these to be rebuilt, even under a more enlightened central government regime, particularly as planning departments also need strengthening in many cases. Housing associations are limited in their capacity to build new homes by their inability to raise equity funding, limits on their gearing levels, and the capital investment required to maintain their existing stock. They can still continue to contribute directly and significantly to the 150,000 new affordable homes a year needed, but also vitally as partners, particularly to private funders and providers, as managers of homes owned and or developed by others. The private sector encompasses landowners, commercial developers, the construction industry, and the specialist, mostly private affordable housing funds and investors. I will touch on landowners in a moment, but will otherwise speak briefly about the specialist funds. If there is not to be a Trussian renouncement of all discipline in public borrowing, which your lordships will know would not happen under my right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, private equity capital is needed to play its part in achieving the challenging targets for new homes, not just the capital, but the development skills as well. PFI and private equity's role in the utility industries, notably the water industry, understandably cause concerns at the prospect of private capital playing a larger part in the affordable housing sector. We should learn from this history. In the water industry, there has been a toxic combination of a disgracefully weak regulator and unfettered, aggressive maximisation of financial returns by some private equity houses. On the one hand, government and parliament must ensure the regulator for social housing is strong and robust. On the other, the specialist funds need to behave in a responsible way. Not a forlorn hope, I believe, in the light of these funds' culture and central position in the ESG and sustainable investing movement, which should also ensure that net zero is embedded in all they do. Finally, central government, which must drive and coordinate all of this and provide the funding for the grants to local authorities, housing authorities and private funders alike, needed to deliver the homes at the affordable and social rents. It has to be recognised that much of these subsidies will be for the southern half of England, given that this is where the gap between market and affordable rents is greatest, and this needs to be reconciled with levelling up ambitions. Should landowners provide more of that subsidy through the imposition of more ambitious Section 106 conditions without choking off the supply of land? That would require cross-party agreement about a long-term policy to remove the incentive for landowners to hang on and hope a future government will introduce a more advantageous regime. A friend with long experience in both the housing association and the private sector said to me this week, "Remember the two Harolds." No, not the two Ronnies, but the fact that only under Harold Macmillan and Harold Wilson in recent history have there been material state-driven expansions of affordable housing. My right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, may not be called Harold, though he is a strong admirer of the Labour Harold's career. I'm confident, though, that he and my right honourable friend Angela Rayner would become honorary Harolds if a Labour government is elected. I'm sorry that we will not have the opportunity to hear today from any latter-day Macmillans from the backbenches opposite, but I hope the noble Baroness, the Minister's reply, will make up for that.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I thank the noble Viscount Lord Chandos for initiating this debate. I congratulate him on a really excellent opening speech, and I look forward to the maiden speech of the noble lady, Baroness Smith of Llanfairse. The background to our debate is a rather frightening recent deterioration in the availability of affordable housing. I have just seen the figures out earlier this month showing a rise of 21,000 children now living in temporary accommodation, up from 121,000 to 142,000 over the last 5 quarters. Temporary accommodation is the best barometer of acute shortages. It is also a hugely expensive alternative to having a sufficient supply of genuinely affordable housing, to use Lord Chandos's phrase, which is seriously compounding local authorities' budgetary problems. The simple reason, my lords, why tens of thousands of children are being expensively and inappropriately housed in temporary accommodation is that there is just not enough housing to go round. The UK has not been building new homes and at an equivalent rate to other European nations. If we had achieved the average new build output for all members of the European Union, the Centre for Cities estimates we would have an additional 4.3 million homes nationwide. And when there is an overall shortage, it is, of course, those on the lowest incomes who are the hardest hit. The Independent Affordable Housing Commission, which reported in 2020, spelt out the twin phenomena of A, the decline of social housing, i.e. provision by councils and housing associations, from 34% down to 17% of the nation's stock, and B, the growth of private renting from 9% up to 20%. Simultaneously, there has been the loss of over 1.5 million social rented homes from sales under the right to buy, more than a third of these now in the hands of private landlords at much higher rents. My lords, the private rented sector is unsuitable or unaffordable for many. So doubling this sector's size and halving that of social housing has left many households with no options. To rebalance the market as between the private rented sector and the social rented sector, the commonly acknowledged solution is to increase the supply of social rented housing, that is, homes that are let at often half the market rents, according to a formula used for most existing social housing. Several studies have concluded that a figure of around 90,000 such homes should be built every year. Secretary of State Michael Gove told the Lords Select Committee on the Built Environment on the 6th of February this year, "We need to aim to have a net addition of 30,000 for social rent every year." This target from the Secretary of State may sound unambitious, but it would mean far greater numbers of social rented homes than have been added in recent years. However, without major changes, there is no possibility of achieving either the overall government target of 300,000 homes a year or within that of 30,000 social rented homes. Indeed, rather than a growth in supply, output in both the private and social sectors has been falling significantly. Higher interest rates and inflation of building costs means social housing grants fund fewer new social rented homes. At the same time, it's become necessary to channel more social housing investment into the existing stock, rather than funding new supply. This follows a number of high-profile cold and mould cases, most notably causing the death of little Awab Ishaq. With the Social Housing Regulation Act 2023 and more powers for the Housing Ombudsman, the housing associations and the stock-holding councils are rightly spending more on retrofitting their existing stock. The result of these trends is a big reduction in the pipeline of new affordable homes. One major housing association, for example, has self-imposed a 2-year moratorium on any new development. Overall starts on site by social landlords are expected to fall this year by more than 30%. Meanwhile, because the private sector house builders, faced with lower profits, are postponing their developments, there are also fewer new social rent homes being achieved through planning gain contributions from the developers. So, my lords, what can be done? And I didn't acknowledge earlier that I should declare my own housing and property interests as on the register. A starting point must surely be to have a national housing strategy. This would comprise an agreed vision for achieving the quantity and quality of new and existing homes that we all seek, with a roadmap to take us to this destination. Following the Church of England's report Coming Home, a number of your lordships have been supporting the Church's subsequent efforts to help create such a strategy. We suggest the establishment of a statutory National Housing Committee modelled on the Climate Change Committee. This would provide a long-term mechanism that holds government to account, irrespective of changes of housing ministers — we've had 16 in the last 14 years — and secretaries of state, monitoring progress toward the agreed goals. It would be wonderful if this concept found its way into party political manifestos. In the short term, there is no escaping the need for government funding, principally via Homes England and the GLA. Most immediately, more investment is needed for property acquisition and modernisation to switch private rented sector properties into social housing and reverse the shocking rise in temporary accommodation spending. But more fundamental change is needed. The Labour Party has made bold statements for growth through developing grey belt land and building a new generation of new towns. For initiatives such as these, any government will need to find ways of making available funding that goes much further and securing a better planning system, a better resourced planning system. To that end, I would advocate the adoption of the model spelt out by Sir Oliver Letwin in his excellent report, which disgracefully has been sitting on the shelf since 2018. The Letwin approach involves ending the dependence on the oligopoly of volume house builders whose interests seldom coincide with the public good, and shifting the initiative for all major housing projects to locally established development corporations. These corporations, which are less susceptible to local opposition, would have CPO powers to acquire land at a price that reflects the content of a master plan, which embraces the necessary infrastructure, green space and facilities. The site would then be parcelled out to the appropriate providers, including social landlords, SME builders, community land trusts, providers of retirement housing, etc. By capturing the uplift in land value for the public good, this model makes possible affordable quality homes at scale. In conclusion, my lords, I suggest, therefore, that the way forward begins with the establishing of a statutory National Housing Committee, just like the Climate Change Committee, which sets out the path to agreed goals and provides the continuity and persistence to see the job done. And to get there, as well as the necessity of more public investment, which is handsomely repaid in lower health, care and welfare spending and improved productivity, there are also bigger and bolder changes of approach to planning and land acquisition that could make a huge difference. It is certainly worth trying against the backdrop of human misery which the severe under-provision of genuinely affordable housing has created.
My Lords, I congratulate my noble friend Viscount Chandos for initiating this debate, and I'm particularly pleased the terminology they used in this debate, the title of this debate. The term genuinely affordable housing is what we're all about. In the government's jargon, affordable has become meaningless. In many parts of the country and for hundreds of thousands of families, 80% of private rent levels are not affordable. And to use that as a term of art in legislation and regulation on affordable rent and affordable housing statistics is actually misleading the depth of the problem that we have to address. I likewise look forward to the maiden speech of Baroness Smith of Llanfaes, and I hope she can bring a different perspective to this. I also am glad to follow the noble Lord Best in one sense, except that he's pinched most of what I was going to say. That isn't going to shut me up, but nevertheless I agree with pretty much all that he said. My lords, in the days of Lloyd George, to which my noble friend referred, after the First World War, around about 75% of people lived in private rented accommodation, most of it pretty squalid, a very significant part of it very insecure, with the powers of landlords being strong. We transformed that over most of the last century, until relatively recently, when we started to go backwards. When, by the 1980s, we were in a position where, from the 1920s onwards, social housing had provided decent housing at affordable prices for a large section of the population, rising to about 30%. Since the 1980s, however, with a right to buy, without the proceeds being 100% fed back to a new building, and with demolitions and with stock transfers, that figure for social housing has fallen, and my knowledge is now down to, I think, about 17%. And of course the prices of new homes, for those in the property market, has risen from 3.5 times average earnings up to something over 8%, 8 times. So both mortgage holders and aspirant mortgage holders and private renters are now struggling. For many people, mortgages are now unattainable, and many who had secured mortgages are now threatened by the phenomenon of rising interest rates. So there is, in every part of the housing market, insecurity, unaffordability, and distress. There is also a decline in physical conditions, which I'll come on to. But at the same time, as Lord Best has said, household formation has continued apace, and the figures that everybody's accepted in recent years, we need to build, or we need to provide, one way or another, 300,000 new homes a year. That figure has never been anything like attained. And in any case, is a bit of an exaggeration. 200,000 that we've hit from time to time, and slightly over 200,000, is a gross figure, not a net figure of demolitions. My lords, it's also been regrettably the case that for most of the last century, social housing has provided a positive, safe and affordable alternative. That has declined over recent years. And the number of scandals in both local authority and housing association accommodation, with mould and damp and unhealthy conditions and repairs not being addressed, has made social housing less attractive. My lords, in the days when both numbers of social housing and the standards in local authority social housing particularly were improving, and it also set the benchmark for the good housing associations, the relationship between local authorities and social landlords generally and the construction industry were very different from what they are now, as the noble Lord Best has implied. On the one hand, local authorities had substantial in-house staff and architects, and had their own direct maintenance staff in most cases, and they were likely to be the main procurer of house construction work in their areas. On the other hand, in those days, the days of Harold Macmillan and Harold Wilson, the construction sector was highly competitive locally, with SMEs, a dozen or so SMEs, mainly large family businesses, were competing for their local authorities' work. Nowadays, as Lord Best has said, most architects' departments and most direct works have been dispensed with, and even a competent clerk of works does not exist, but the house or building sector is dominated by large house builders and large developers, which means that the balance of power within the house building market has changed dramatically, and we need to do something to change that. There are people, my lords, who blame the planning system for the lack of providing new houses, and the planning system is not perfect, but we don't want to uproot it entirely, because it does actually protect the environment in which people live and the provision of decent housing. And it's not the planning system that is the major problem, but frankly, the fact that when planning permission has been granted, there's probably up to 1 million homes which have not yet been started. And it is that, rather than blockages in the planning system, which are meaning that the supply of new homes has been so diminished. And the reduction of environmental standards or loosening planning restrictions will not speed up that process unless we address it directly by ensuring that starts are made in those areas. We also have to recognise that the usual figure for new homes required, new homes completed, is the gross figure, not the net figure. In other words, it is not, doesn't take account of demolitions, particularly demolitions of social housing. I've argued before in this chamber that the predilection of many developers, and in some cases planning committees, for both public and private estates, to go for demolition and rebuild rather than the option of retrofit, which is both environmentally more sensible and is likely to be much less socially disruptive, is also a problem for us. We need to make sure that in all major planning permissions, the alternative of retrofit is always considered. My Lords, we are going to need more social housing, and most of that is going to come from local authorities. And as I've said, local authorities, both in the financial terms and in terms of their expert staffing, have been sadly diminished from the great days. I did at one point think, or was nearly persuaded, that the idea of having hived off arm's length companies owned by local authorities would help do that. But we've seen local authorities of all political persuasions have their fingers very severely burnt by going down that road. And what we need is something closer to what Lord Best was arguing for, of regionally based local authority area corporations who become the major procurer within the housing market and therefore can face down the house builders in their intention to, for example, in any major mixed development, keep the level of social housing at a low level, and then halfway through the project say they can no longer afford that and get it reduced yet further. That phenomenon needs to be removed from the housing market. My Lords, I agree with Lord Best that we need a new housing strategy. Whether it's a housing committee or a housing corporation or a housing cabinet committee, I don't mind, as long as we have an overall approach to it which can face up to all of these problems. My Lords, for many families, for many key workers, as my noble Lord Viscount Chandos has said, for many key workers, it is impossible to find a place to live they can both afford and be safe and secure in. We need to make a change. I hope the Labour government will make a change. But, my Lords, whoever is running this country in the next few years, the housing problem for the least secure people in this country needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed urgently.
My Lords, when my colleague, my noble friend, Lord Wigley, made his maiden speech in your Lordship's house, he spoke of his election alongside the noble Lord, Lord Ellis Thomas, to the other place in 1974. He said, "It was once suggested that the two of us entered the place as revolutionaries and departed as mere reformers, but if the objectives which we then had, to which I still aspire, of a new relationship between the nations of these islands can be achieved by reforming the structures of government, that is all to the good. And if the process of devolution allows Wales to take appropriate decisions on an all-Wales level and to have its voice heard when other decisions are taken on a wider basis, that is also to the good. As I begin my time in your Lordship's house, I associate myself with those words. And I pay tribute to my noble friend Lord Wigley, not only for his many years of dedicated service in your lordship's house, but also for his decades of public and political service to my party and to Wales.
Hear, hear.
I can only hope to follow in his footsteps, and in times perhaps to earn the same level of esteem in which he is held. It will not have escaped your lordship's attention, though, however, and I know that my noble friend won't mind my saying this, that I do look rather differently to Lord Wigley. Since my nomination was announced, much comment has been made about my age, the colour of my hair, and my choice of footwear. And I assure your lordships that I'll be proud to wear my Doc Martens in this place. My lords, I am young, I'm a woman, and I'm from Wales. Your lordships know well that is not the norm for this place. And I'm now one of only 36 members of your lordship's house who is below the age of 50. One of only 6 below the age of 40, and the only one below the age of 30. And I'm conscious of the particular responsibility which now falls to me, not only as the youngest current member of your lordship's house, but also the youngest life peer to ever have been created. My responsibility, as I see it, is to not just be my own voice or that of my party or my country, but to be a voice of my generation. And my own experience is that of growing up on a council estate in Llanfaes in Ynys Môn as a young carer to my dear late father, battling on a daily basis the kind of prejudices and barriers that too many of our fellow citizens still face, trying to find hope and build a future for myself in a world where the odds seem to be stacked against people like me. Burning with anger at the deprivation to which my community had been subjected. And these experiences are not unique to me. My generation has a particular experience, a particular perspective, which deserves and needs to be reflected in this place. We grew up through the global recession at the end of the first decade of this century. We grew up in the shadow of terrorism at home and overseas. We grew up with the internet and social media. We grew up in the age of devolution. We grew up with the ever-growing threat and reality of climate change and mankind's destruction of the natural world. We grew up at a time of increasing and often aggressive polarisation in our politics, in the age of Trump and Brexit, and we became adults in the age of COVID. During our short lifetimes, we have seen inequality grow and poverty deepen, and we see, despite our protests, the world leaders facing still to respond adequately to the climate and nature crises. We see wealth inequality all around us. We see high debts and housing costs, low wages and unstable work. And that is why I'm particularly pleased to be making my maiden speech during this debate. And I thank the noble Lord, Lord Chandos, for bringing this motion today. In August last year, the Wales Expert Group on the Cost of Living Crisis noted that rising rent and mortgage payments are affecting households' disposable income, and that low-income households are particularly affected. They also said that the full impact of poor housing security is yet to be felt, and that by May 2023, the number of people placed in temporary accommodation, including children, had increased by 1/3 on the previous year. The housing and homelessness charity Shelter Cymru, meanwhile, says that young people are not on an even footing with their older peers. They tend to have lower incomes and are more likely to be earning minimum wage and or work in zero-hour contracts. They're penalised by the UK welfare system, which limits their entitlement to housing benefit, and are routinely discriminated against and exploited by landlords and letting agents when attempting to rent in the private sector. Housing is, of course, a devolved subject area, but social security is not, and it is the interplay of these two dimensions that is of critical importance. Data shows that by the spring of last year, around 67,000 people in Wales were on social housing waiting lists, and almost 7,000 were in emergency accommodation. And then by October of last year, almost 90,000 were on waiting lists, and over 11,000 were in temporary accommodation, of which almost 3,500 were children. And of course, many of us in Wales know all too well the difficulty that so many people, especially young people, face in buying a home in their own community, particularly in the rural and coastal parts of Wales, where the Welsh language is the strongest. And for these reasons, it is imperative that the voices of young people are included in your Lordship's deliberations. Since the announcement of my nomination to this place, I have been quite open in my view that, although I believe Welsh voices are necessary here now, while this place has a say in the laws that govern Wales, I do not believe that an unelected upper chamber has a place in a modern democratic society. While I may be in the minority in your Lordship's House in holding that view, I would not be doing my job if I did not continue to express it. Nevertheless, it is my intention to be constructive in my contributions here, and I look forward to offering my perspective and sharing my voice in your Lordship's deliberations, and I look for your support as I do that. In closing, I should like to thank my supporters, my noble friend Lord Wigley, and the noble Baroness Lady Bennet, and all those noble lords and baronesses who have taken the time to welcome me and offer me their advice since my arrival. I have been touched and humbled by the welcome that I have received. And I also offer my thanks to Black Rod, the clerks, the doorkeepers and security services and the police and the many and various members of staff, both party and parliamentary, who have all been unfailingly warm and courteous in the welcome that they've given me. And I thank my friends in the other place and look forward to working alongside them in Wales's interests. And finally, I thank my family and friends for the love and support that they have given me. I am the person I am because of them, and I can only hope to do them proud. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
My Lords, it's an honour and a privilege to follow the maiden speech of the noble Baroness Lady Smith of Llanfairpwll, who I will call my noble friend, because constructive cooperative politics has to be a way forward in this changing, challenging world. I'm delighted to congratulate the noble lady on a spectacular maiden speech. The voice of Wales has very definitely been heard, as it so often has been heard from the noble Lord Wigley. And the arrival of Doc Martens has been duly noted. I would believe, my Lords, that we need to hear many more younger voices in your Lordship's House, and I hope that the noble lady will not be the youngest member for too long. The noble lady and her peers are the experts of the experience of being in the world today, the experience of being a young person in a world today. And it is crucially important, and I have no doubt at all that the noble lady will be bringing so much of that voice to us. Now, as we've just heard, and as the noble lady told the Times, she plans to stand up for the people of Wales, and of course as the former Chief of Staff for Plaid Cymru in the Senate, and also working in the European Parliament, the noble lady brings great experience and knowledge from that. We're also talking, of course, about the balance of representation. Gender, we are still a very, very long way from the 50-50 Parliament that the Excellent Campaign group is calling for, but also in terms of age. But we need these experiences. We desperately need these experiences. Now, the newspapers have also got very excited about the noble lady's desire, which I share, to replace your lordships with an elected body. She, with greater cause than I, has great reason to ensure that she does not have a life sentence in your Lordship's House. Now, I wish to thank the noble Viscount Chandos for giving us the opportunity to debate this absolutely crucial issue, and particularly, as the noble Lord Whitty commented, on the way the debate is titled in talking about genuinely affordable housing. And that qualifier is needed because, of course, we have now, in terms of housing, something of a word soup of terms relating to the kind of housing tenure. the government's term affordable rent, and there's also the related intermediate rent. This was introduced affordable rent in 2021, set at 80% of market rate, inclusive of charges. Intermediate rent is also available but at levels about 20% lower than the market rate, primarily to lower income households in London and the South East. We've got the London living rent, introduced to help middle income earners save for a deposit to purchase a house. We've got shared ownership, a form of tenure that all too often we're increasingly hearing is not so much a step up onto the housing ladder, but a great weight acting around the neck of people who are unable to escape from service charges, from unaffordable mortgages. We have the First Home Scheme, a kind of discounted market house, sale house, offered at a minimum reduction of 30% against the market value. We have to hope that there are not too many people in the age of the current level of mortgage rates who find that also a great burden. And I think we have to look at this in the context of how genuinely affordable housing, what has been termed a genuine living rent, can be calculated. The general rule is that households should not have to spend more than 30% of their monthly income on rent. That's in a broader frame of what's known as the 50-30-20 rule. Households should be able to spend 50% on their income on their needs, 30% on their wants, and have 20% available for paying off of debt or saving. My lords, there are very few households in the UK today who are in that situation, the situation that we should actually be aiming for. And if we look at some figures from the National Housing Association, Housing Federation, they estimate that by the end of the next Parliament, 1 in 5 households, more than 4.8 million households, will be forced to spend more than 30% of their income on rent. That's an increase on 30% on the figures now. And of course, the other end of this rather disastrous housing pipeline is rough sleeping. We all see this every day. We see this on the streets around your lordship's house. There's been a 20% increase in rough sleeping in the last year, and 280,000 households in temporary accommodation. So I've done the depressing stuff. I want to focus on the positive, just a hint of what's possible. And for this, I'm going to Lewes District Council, and I'm going to Fort Road in Lewes. In 2020, the council took a disused council office building there and replaced it with an award-winning block of 13 council-owned apartments, which provide safe, spacious, bright apartments with a very high level of building performance and a renewable energy strategy. Designed using Fabric First principles, they have a large solar photovoltaic array with 13 individual domestic batteries. That means that the electricity costs are estimated to be 60% below the normal. The house also, importantly, has fire safety features, which are currently not required but are anticipated for the future. Fireproof materials and cutting-edge suppression systems. These are not only affordable homes and quality homes, but very safe to live in, something we need to think more about. Now, I point to this because it's not just simply a one-off. I go to announcements made by the Green leader of Lewes District Council, Councillor Zoe Nicholson, who in March pointed out how the council has purchased brownfield land around the Peacehaven Golf Club and is hoping to also develop council-owned brownfield site in Ringmere. 24 homes on the Peacehaven site, more homes on these other sites. They're also looking at old garage sites, 11 locations that could see 45 new homes. And I focus on that, my lords, because both the Noble Lord Best and the Noble Lord Whitty focused on a centralised national approach to solving our housing crisis. Well, my lords, there's no doubt that resources and changing regulations and rules need to come from the centre, but my argument would be that we need to resource local authorities, local communities, to provide the housing they need in their local community according to their local desires, rather than something centrally enforced from the centre. But the need for change in the centre comes to one particular issue that I want to focus on in this speech, which is right to buy, which has been one of the enormous privatisations continued over decades under governments of different hues that has done great damage to our national social structure, our communities, and continues to do so. Because I spoke about the exciting things happening in Lewis. Well, similar things happened a few years ago in Norwich, in Goldsmith Street, where ultra-low energy passive house homes just outside the city centre were built in 2019 and won the Reba Sterling Prize for Architecture. But after 3 years, the tenants have the right to buy, and it now looks like that Norwich is going to lose a number of those homes, those brilliant social homes, to the private sector. And this, of course, is something that's happened to 2 million homes since 1980. Norwich has more than 4,000 people on the waiting list, and yet there and all around the country we are still losing more social homes than we are managed to build. So I've got a question to the Minister. What is the current rate of loss of social homes to right to buy? And I have a question that perhaps the Labour front bench might like to address. Why do they not plan to abandon this disastrous policy of privatisation? And I come now to some of the other costs of all of this. And I should perhaps declare my position as a Vice President of the Local Government Association at this point. Councils are spending $1.74 billion a year on temporary accommodation. This situation is a large part of the driver that is sending councils bankrupt. On LGA figures, 10,896 homes were sold in the last 5